My son-in-law made a joke during Thanksgiving dinner. The garage is ready for you to live in. Everyone laughed. I had been hiding my hotel empire for 2 years, enduring his jokes. When I turned on the TV and showed my $10 million acquisition, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The smell of turkey and cranberry sauce should have made me feel grateful. Instead, it made my stomach turn as I sat at the far end of the dining table, watching my son-in-law Mark hold court like he owned the place. Which, in a way, he did. This was his house, his Thanksgiving dinner, his show. "So, Barry," Mark said, cutting into his turkey with theatrical precision, "how's the job hunt going? Still looking for work at 59? He chuckled, and my daughter Sarah smiled that tight, uncomfortable smile she always wore when Mark started his verbal target practice on me. I forced myself to swallow the dry piece of turkey in my mouth. "Still exploring opportunities," I replied quietly, keeping my voice steady. 2 years of this. 2 years of being treated like a charity case at my own daughter's table. Mark's laugh was loud and sharp. "Opportunities. That's a nice way to put it." He looked around the table at Sarah's kids, my grandchildren, who were old enough to understand the subtext. "Well, don't worry about it too much. The garage is always ready for you to move into." The table erupted in nervous laughter. Sarah laughed the loudest, probably to cover her embarrassment. Even my 8-year-old grandson Tyler giggled, not really understanding why it was funny, but knowing he was supposed to laugh when Daddy made jokes about Grandpa Barry. I sat there, my hands gripping my napkin under the table, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation spread across my chest. The garage joke. This was the 3rd time this month Mark had made it, and it never got less painful. The implication was clear. I was so pathetic, so broke, so worthless that living in their garage would be an improvement over whatever sad existence I was currently managing. "That's enough, Mark," Sarah said half-heartedly, but she was still smiling, still choosing him over me, just like she had for the past 5 years. "What? I'm just saying we're family. We take care of each other." Mark reached over and patted my shoulder with mock affection. "Right, Barry. Family's got to stick together." I nodded and managed what I hoped looked like a grateful smile. "Absolutely. Family." But inside, I was thinking about the call I'd received 3 days ago, the one from my attorney, confirming that the final paperwork had gone through, the one that made me, as of last Tuesday, the owner of a $10 million hotel chain. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been sleeping in those very hotels for the past 2 years, moving from property to property, reinvesting every penny while my family thought I was living in some rundown apartment, scraping by on whatever odd jobs I could find. "You know what Barry really needs?" Mark continued, warming up to his audience. "A nice steady job, something with security, maybe at a hotel, cleaning rooms, carrying bags. No shame in honest work, right?" My grandson Tyler piped up innocently. "Is Grandpa Barry poor?" The question hit the table like a dropped glass, shattering the thin veneer of politeness. Sarah's face went red. "Tyler, that's not... We don't ask questions like that." "But Daddy said..." "Tyler, eat your dinner." Mark cut him off, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. Mission accomplished. He'd managed to humiliate me in front of my own grandchildren again. I looked around the table at these people who were supposed to be my family. Sarah, my only child, who used to call me her hero when she was little. Now she couldn't even make eye contact with me. Mark, who'd swooped in during the worst period of my life and convinced everyone he was the successful one, the provider, the man Sarah should listen to instead of her broken-down father. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was the loneliness. Sitting surrounded by family and feeling completely alone. They didn't know me anymore. They didn't know what I'd been through, what I'd survived, what I'd built. They only saw the version of me that fit their narrative. Barry the failure, Barry the burden, Barry the man who'd lost everything and would never get it back. "More wine, Barry?" Sarah asked, probably trying to change the subject. "No, thank you. I needed to stay sharp tonight." Tomorrow, the local news would be running the story about Grandview Hospitality Group's acquisition of the Riverside hotel chain. Tomorrow, everything would change. Mark was still talking, regaling the table with stories about his latest promotion at the accounting firm, his new car lease, their plans for Christmas vacation. "We're thinking Cabo this year," he said, cutting another piece of turkey. Of course, it's expensive, but you've got to live a little, right? Can't take it with you. He glanced at me when he said it, the implication clear. Unlike some people at this table, he could afford to live a little. I smiled and nodded, thinking about the Cabo resort I'd been considering for my next acquisition. Beachfront property, 97 rooms, projected revenue of $12 million annually. Not bad for a man who was supposedly too broke to live anywhere but his son-in-law's garage. After dinner, I helped clear the table while Mark settled into his recliner to watch football. Sarah was loading the dishwasher when she finally spoke to me directly. "Dad, are you really doing okay? I mean, financially?" She kept her voice low, glancing toward the living room where Mark was shouting at the television. For a moment, I almost told her. Almost broke 2 years of careful secrecy to let my daughter know that her father wasn't the failure everyone thought he was. But then I heard Mark's voice from the other room. "Sarah, tell your dad he can crash on the couch tonight if he needs to. I'm feeling generous." The offer was meant to sound kind, but I heard the condescension dripping from every word. "Tell your dad," like I was some stray dog Sarah had brought home. "Thanks for dinner," I said instead, kissing Sarah's cheek. "I should get going." "Dad, wait," but I was already grabbing my coat from the closet. As I walked to my car, I could hear Mark through the window, already making jokes to the kids about Grandpa Barry's mysterious living situation. The laughter followed me all the way to my rental car, a modest Honda that I'd deliberately chosen to maintain my cover. 20 minutes later, I was walking through the marble lobby of the Grandview Plaza, my flagship property downtown. The night manager nodded respectfully as I passed. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison. How was your holiday?" "Enlightening," I replied, heading toward the elevator that would take me to my penthouse suite. "Very enlightening indeed. Tomorrow the charade would end. Tomorrow my family would learn that the man they'd been pitying, mocking, and patronizing for 2 years was actually more successful than any of them had ever dreamed of being. But tonight, I was still just Barry the failure, Barry the burden. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. I woke up in my penthouse suite at 5 a.m., just like every morning for the past 2 years. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but today the sight brought me no satisfaction. Instead, I found myself staring at the framed photo on my nightstand, Sarah's wedding day, 7 years ago. I was still smiling in that picture, still believing that family meant something. That was before the divorce, before I lost everything, before Mark convinced my daughter that her father was a man worth abandoning. The coffee maker in my suite was one of those expensive European models, the kind Mark would probably covet if he knew I owned it. But Mark didn't know anything about my life now. Just like he didn't know anything about my life 5 years ago when it all fell apart. I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and Linda, my ex-wife of 23 years, was sitting across from me at our kitchen table with divorce papers spread out like a battle plan. "You get nothing, Barry. Nothing." Her voice was cold, clinical. "The house, the business, the savings accounts, I'm taking it all." I'd built Morrison Construction from the ground up, working 16-hour days for 2 decades. But Linda was smarter than I was, at least when it came to protecting her interests. She'd been planning the divorce for months, moving money, consulting lawyers, building her case while I was too busy working to notice. "What about Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda's smile was sharp as a knife. "Sarah will understand. She'll see that I'm the stable parent, the one who can provide for her future. I should have fought harder, should have hired better lawyers, should have seen it coming. But I was 54 years old, devastated, and completely unprepared for the level of calculation Linda was capable of. Within 6 months, I went from owning a $1 million construction company to living in a studio apartment with nothing but my pickup truck and a checking account with $3,000 in it. The worst part wasn't losing the money or the house, it was losing Sarah. I could still remember the phone call when she told me she was engaged. Not in person, not over dinner, but a brief, awkward phone call on a Thursday evening. "His name is Mark, Dad. He's an accountant. He's stable." The word hung between us like an accusation. Stable. Everything I wasn't anymore. "I'd like to meet him," I said, "maybe later, when things settle down." But things never settled down. By the time I met Mark, he'd already heard the story Linda had crafted. Barry Morrison, the failed businessman who'd lost everything through poor decisions and irresponsibility. Barry Morrison, the man who couldn't be trusted to manage his own life, let alone be a reliable grandfather. The first time Mark made a joke about my financial situation, Sarah laughed. That's when I knew I'd lost her completely. She'd chosen the narrative that was easier to accept, that her father was a failure, rather than asking what had really happened. So I made a decision that night, lying in my cramped studio apartment, listening to the neighbor's television through the thin walls. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to explain. I was going to prove them wrong, but I was going to do it my way, in my own time. I started small, very small. With the $3,000 I had left and a credit card that wasn't maxed out, I bought a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. 12 rooms, half of them unusable, the other half barely habitable. I spent my days renovating, learning plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos, sleeping on a cot in the manager's office. For 6 months, nobody knew what I was doing. When Sarah called, which wasn't often, I told her I was looking for work. It wasn't technically a lie. I was working, just not for someone else. The first year was hell. I ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I care to remember. I wore the same 3 shirts in rotation because I couldn't afford to buy new ones. Every penny went back into the business. New mattresses, fresh paint, a functioning air conditioning system. Slowly, the motel started attracting customers. By the end of the first year, I was breaking even. By the end of the second year, I was making a profit. And then I bought another property. A small inn 2 towns over, in worse shape than the first place, but with better bones. I moved from property to property, sleeping in my own hotels while I fixed them up, reinvesting every dollar I made. The hardest part wasn't the physical work or the financial stress. It was the isolation. Sarah would call occasionally, usually when Mark wasn't around, and ask how I was doing. I could hear the pity in her voice, the assumption that I was struggling, that I needed her charity. "Dad, if you need money." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." But she did worry, in that distant, obligation-fulfilling way. She worried enough to invite me to Thanksgiving dinners where I was treated like a recovering addict who might relapse at any moment. She worried enough to suggest, gently, that maybe I should consider something more stable, like a regular job. What she didn't know was that while she was worrying about me, I was learning the hotel business from the ground up. I studied hospitality management online, took courses in business administration, networked with other property owners. I was methodical, patient, strategic. By year 3, I owned 6 properties. By year 4, I had 12. And last month, when the Riverside hotel chain went up for sale, I had enough capital and financing in place to make an offer that their board couldn't refuse. $10 million, 15 properties across 3 states, 237 employees who now called me their boss. I poured myself another cup of coffee and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from my attorney, probably confirming that the news release had gone out to the local media. By noon today, everyone in town would know that Barry Morrison wasn't just back. He was bigger than he'd ever been before. I thought about calling Sarah, giving her a heads up before she heard it from someone else. But then I remembered last night's dinner. Mark's smug face as he made his garage joke. Sarah's uncomfortable laughter. Tyler asking if I was poor while the adults pretended not to hear. No. They'd find out the same way everyone else would. And then they'd have to decide whether they wanted to be part of my life or continue believing the story they'd been telling themselves about who I was. I finished my coffee, put on my best suit, and headed down to the lobby. I had a business empire to run, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who I'd become. The man they'd all underestimated was about to remind them that sometimes, the people you write off are the ones who surprise you the most. The morning news was already running the story when I arrived at my office. Through the glass windows of the Grandview Plaza's executive suite, I could see the reporter standing in front of the Riverside Hotel's main entrance, explaining to viewers how a local businessman had just completed the largest hospitality acquisition in the region's history. But as I watched the coverage, my mind wasn't on business metrics or profit margins. It was stuck on a memory from 3 years ago that still felt like a fresh wound. I'd been working on my 3rd property then, a small bed and breakfast that needed extensive renovations. My hands were permanently stained with paint and grout, my back ached from laying tile, and I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night. That's when I got the call from my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. "Barry, I thought you should know. I saw Sarah's wedding announcement in the paper today." The words hit me like a physical blow. Wedding announcement, in the paper. My only child was getting married, and I was finding out about it from a neighbor who'd read it in the local Gazette. I drove to the newsstand with paint still under my fingernails, bought a copy of the paper with shaking hands. There it was, in black and white. Sarah Morrison and Mark Williams announced their engagement. The couple will wed in June at the Riverside Country Club. The same Riverside Country Club that Linda and I had looked at for Sarah's Sweet 16 party, back when we were still a family. Back when I still thought I'd be walking my daughter down the aisle someday. I called Sarah that night, my heart pounding as the phone rang. "Oh, Dad, hi." Her voice was strained, guilty. "I was going to call you." "Were you?" I couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice. "When, Sarah?" "After the wedding." "It's complicated, Dad. Mark's family is. They're very traditional. They're handling most of the planning, and the guest list is limited. I'm your father. I know you are. But Dad, you have to understand. Mark's parents are paying for everything. His father owns 3 restaurants. His mother is on the hospital board. They move in different circles, and they're just not sure." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They weren't sure about me, the broken-down ex-husband who'd lost his business, his house, his respectability. I wasn't the kind of father they wanted their son-in-law associated with. "What about you, Sarah? What do you want?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "I want everyone to get along," she finally whispered. "I want my wedding day to be perfect." Perfect. And apparently that perfection didn't include me. The wedding was held on a Saturday in June. I know because I drove by the country club that day, seeing the cars in the parking lot, the flowers at the entrance, the happiness I wasn't allowed to be part of. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, watching people I didn't recognize walk in, wearing their finest clothes to celebrate my daughter's marriage. I never saw the photos. Sarah didn't send any, but Mrs. Peterson did, a few weeks later. She'd gotten them from a mutual friend who'd attended. Sarah looked beautiful in her white dress, radiant and happy. Mark looked proud and handsome in his tuxedo. And in the photo where Sarah was dancing with her new father-in-law, the space where I should have been was just empty. That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came 18 months later, when I found out I had a grandson. I discovered Tyler's existence the same way I'd discovered Sarah's engagement, through someone else. This time, it was my former business partner, Jim, who ran into me at the hardware store. "Hey, Barry, congratulations on becoming a grandpa." Jim Patterson showed me pictures of that baby boy. Cute kid. Looks just like Sarah did when she was little. I stood there in the paint aisle, holding a can of primer, feeling the world tilt sideways. Grandson, baby boy, pictures that everyone had seen except me. When I called Sarah that night, she cried, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I meant to tell you. I meant to call, but Tyler was premature and there were complications, and Mark's been so stressed with work, and I didn't know how to." "How old is he?" My voice sounded hollow, even to me. 4 months. 4 months. My grandson was 4 months old, and I didn't even know his name until that phone call. While I'd been renovating hotels and building my secret empire, my family had been growing without me. Sarah had been learning to be a mother, Mark had been becoming a father, and Tyler had been taking his first breaths, learning to smile, discovering the world, all of it happening in a life I wasn't part of. "Can I meet him?" Another silence. "Of course, yes, soon, we'll arrange something." But soon became next month, which became next season, which became the following year. There was always a reason. Tyler was teething. Tyler had a cold. Mark's parents were visiting. Sarah was tired. The timing wasn't right. When I finally met my grandson, he was walking. My first grandchild took his first steps, said his first words, celebrated his first birthday, and I missed all of it. When Sarah finally brought him to see me at what she thought was my dingy apartment, Tyler hid behind her legs, staring at me like I was a stranger. Which I suppose I was. "Say hi to Grandpa Barry," Sarah encouraged, but Tyler just buried his face against her jeans. I'd brought him a toy truck, something I'd picked out carefully from the hotel gift shop. But Tyler wasn't interested. He was interested in the expensive tablet Mark had gotten him, the one that played videos and games and kept him occupied while the adults talked. "He's shy," Sarah explained apologetically, but I could see the truth in her eyes. Tyler wasn't shy. He just didn't know me. And why would he? I was the grandfather who existed on the periphery of his life, the one who showed up occasionally with awkward presence and no real place in the family structure Mark had built. Over the next 2 years, I saw Tyler maybe a dozen times, always at family gatherings where I was clearly the outsider. Always with Mark making subtle comments about my situation, my prospects, my inability to get my life together. and always with Sarah caught in the middle, wanting to include me, but not wanting to upset her husband. The breaking point came last Christmas. I'd been invited to Sarah's house for dinner, but when I arrived, I found out that Mark's parents were there too. The Williamses, successful, established, everything I wasn't supposed to be anymore. "Barry!" Mark's mother, Diane, greeted me with that overly bright smile people use when they're being charitable. "How wonderful that you could join us. Sarah was just telling us about your job situation. Still looking for something steady?" The conversation went downhill from there. Mark's father, Robert, owned a chain of restaurants and couldn't resist giving me advice about getting back on your feet at your age. Diane kept making comments about how challenging it must be to start over after 50. And Mark, emboldened by his parents' presence, was more condescending than ever. "You know, Barry, my dad might have some connections. Maybe something in food service. It's honest work." Food service. The man sitting across from me, eating dinner in a house I could buy with cash, was suggesting I get a job serving food. The irony was almost too perfect. Tyler, now 3, spent the entire evening playing with the expensive toys his other grandparents had brought him. When I tried to engage with him, he politely answered my questions but kept looking toward Mark's parents, the grandparents who took him to baseball games and bought him bicycles and were present for every important moment of his young life. That night, driving back to my hotel, I made a decision. I was done being the charity case, done being the embarrassment, done watching my family pretend I didn't matter while treating Mark's family like royalty. It was time for them to learn that the man they'd been pitying was actually the most successful person in that room. Time for Mark to discover that his condescending jokes were being directed at someone who could buy and sell everything he owned. But I wanted the revelation to be perfect. I wanted the moment when their world shifted to be as devastating as all the moments when mine had been shattered. I started planning that night, and I'd been perfecting the plan ever since. Tomorrow's news coverage was just the beginning. The real show would come when they realized that all their assumptions about Barry Morrison had been completely, utterly wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September, 3 months before that fateful Thanksgiving dinner. I was inspecting the renovation progress at my newest property when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from Hartwell & Associates. I represent the Riverside Hotel Group. We understand you might be interested in acquisition opportunities." I almost dropped the phone. Riverside Hotel Group wasn't just any hotel chain. It was the most prestigious hospitality brand in our region. 15 properties, including the flagship Riverside Country Club, where Sarah had gotten married without me. The same place where Mark's family had celebrated while I sat in my truck outside, uninvited and unwanted. "I'm listening," I said, stepping away from my contractors. "The board has decided to sell. They're looking for a serious buyer who understands the industry and has the capital to maintain their standards. Your name came up through our industry contacts." My name. After 5 years of rebuilding from nothing, Barry Morrison was finally being mentioned in the same sentence as $10 million acquisitions. "What's the asking price?" $10.2 million for the entire portfolio. But Mr. Morrison, I should mention, we've had inquiries from 3 major hotel chains. This won't be an easy acquisition. I smiled, looking out at the hotel I was standing in, my 12th property, nearly at capacity every night. "Ms. Walsh, I'd like to schedule a meeting. When can we discuss terms?" What Jennifer Walsh didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Every decision I'd made, every property I'd purchased, every relationship I'd built in the industry had been leading toward one goal: becoming successful enough to matter again. Successful enough to show my family that they'd written off the wrong man. The due diligence process took 6 weeks. I flew to Chicago to meet with the Riverside board, wearing a suit that cost more than Mark's monthly car payment. I presented financial statements that showed not just my ability to purchase the chain, but to expand it. I brought architects' renderings for planned renovations, marketing strategies for increased occupancy rates, and a 5-year business plan that impressed even the skeptical board members. "Mr. Morrison," the chairman said during our final meeting, "your proposal is ambitious, but can you explain the gap in your recent business history? Our research shows you had some financial difficulties a few years ago." I'd been expecting this question. Gentlemen, sometimes the best lessons come from the worst experiences. I lost everything in a divorce, and it taught me what really matters in business: careful planning, conservative growth, and never depending on anyone else for my success. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. What I didn't tell them was that my financial difficulties had made me hungrier, more focused, more determined than I'd ever been when success came easily. 3 weeks later, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "Congratulations, Mr. Morrison. The board has accepted your offer." I was sitting in my office at the Grandview Plaza when Jennifer delivered the news. Through my window, I could see the city where my family lived, where they continued to think of me as Barry the failure. In a few hours, I would own more hotel rooms in this region than anyone else. But the real victory wasn't the acquisition itself. It was what the acquisition included: the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where Sarah had gotten married without inviting me, where Mark's family had celebrated their son's wedding while I sat in the parking lot, watching strangers walk into my daughter's reception. In 3 hours, I would own that building. The chandeliers Sarah had danced under, the ballroom where Mark had given his speech, the grounds where photographers had captured the happiest day of my daughter's life, all of it would belong to me. The paperwork signing was scheduled for that Thursday. I met Jennifer at the law offices downtown, surrounded by attorneys and accountants and executives in expensive suits. When I signed the final document making me the owner of the Riverside Hotel Group, I thought about calling Sarah immediately. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of all those times I'd called with good news: a new property purchase, a successful quarter, a business milestone, only to hear the polite disinterest in her voice. Maybe it was remembering how Mark had dismissed my little motel business when I'd tried to explain what I was building. "Just be careful you don't get in over your head," he'd said, not even looking up from his phone. "The hotel business is complicated. Maybe stick to something simpler." Simpler. Like he understood the first thing about what I'd been doing for the past 5 years. No, I decided. I wouldn't call Sarah. I wouldn't send a press release to the family. I would let them discover my success the same way I'd discovered Tyler's birth, Sarah's engagement, and every other major event in their lives, through someone else, when it was too late for me to be part of the moment. The local news picked up the story 3 days later. "Local businessman acquires Riverside hotel chain in $10. $2 million deal," read the headline in the morning paper. The article included a photo of me shaking hands with the former board chairman, both of us smiling for the cameras. I bought 5 copies of that paper and kept them on my desk. One for each year I'd spent rebuilding my life while my family assumed I was failing. That weekend, I drove to each of my new properties. 15 hotels and resorts, from the downtown flagship to the mountain lodge 2 hours north. At each stop, I met with managers, reviewed operations, and introduced myself as their new owner. Professional, successful, respected, everything Mark insisted I could never be again. The Riverside Country Club was my last stop. I walked through the same entrance where wedding guests had streamed in 3 years ago, past the reception desk where Sarah had probably signed the guest book, into the ballroom where she'd danced with Mark's father because her own father wasn't there. "Mr. Morrison," the manager greeted me respectfully. "Welcome to the Riverside. We're honored to be part of your organization." Honored. The same building where I'd been considered too much of an embarrassment to invite to my own daughter's wedding was now part of my business empire. I spent an hour touring the facilities, but my mind kept drifting to that December day when I'd sat outside in my truck. How different things would have been if Sarah had known then what she would know soon. If Mark had realized that the man he was shutting out would someday own the very place where he'd celebrated his wedding. But they didn't know, and that was the point. For 5 years, they'd operated under the assumption that Barry Morrison was finished, washed up, irrelevant. They'd made decisions about my place in their lives based on who they thought I was, not who I was becoming. The irony was perfect. The country club where I'd been unwelcome was now my property. The venue that had been too good for me was now part of my portfolio. The place where Mark's family had demonstrated their superiority was now owned by the man they'd considered beneath their notice. As I walked back to my car that evening, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Sarah's number. My thumb hovered over the call button. Part of me wanted to tell her everything: the acquisition, the success, the fact that her father wasn't the failure everyone believed he was. But then I remembered the garage joke from last month's dinner. Mark's smug laughter, Sarah's uncomfortable smile. Tyler asking if I was poor while the adults pretended not to hear. No, they would find out on their own terms, the same way they'd handled everything else in our relationship for the past 5 years, and when they did, they would have to decide whether they wanted to be part of the life I'd built without them. I put the phone back in my pocket and drove home to my penthouse suite. Tomorrow was another day of running my hotel empire. Tonight I was just Barry Morrison, The man who'd proven that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who surprise you the most. The surprise was coming soon. Very soon. The second Thanksgiving dinner at Sarah and Mark's house felt like déjà vu, except this time I wasn't nervous. This time, I was ready. I arrived exactly on time, carrying the same modest bottle of wine I'd brought the year before. Nothing about my appearance suggested that anything had changed. Same rental car, same department store clothes, same quiet demeanor that had made me invisible at family gatherings for the past 5 years. "Barry," Mark greeted me at the door with his usual condescending smile. "Glad you could make it. How's the job search going? Any luck this week?" "Still exploring opportunities," I replied, just like always. But this time the words carried a weight Mark couldn't possibly understand. Sarah hugged me briefly, that same uncomfortable hug she'd been giving me since the divorce. "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling? You look, I don't know, different today." She was right. I did feel different. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't walking into this house as a charity case. I wasn't the father they pitied or the grandfather they barely tolerated. I was Barry Morrison, owner of a $10 million hotel empire, and they just didn't know it yet. Dinner proceeded exactly as I'd expected. Mark dominated the conversation, bragging about his latest client acquisitions, their plans for a European vacation, Tyler's expensive private school. The same performance I'd endured countless times before. "You know, Barry," Mark said, cutting his turkey with theatrical precision, "I've been thinking about your situation. Maybe it's time to consider something more realistic. At 59, you can't be too picky about opportunities." Tyler, now 8 and old enough to understand the subtext, looked at me with the same mixture of pity and confusion he'd worn last year. My grandson had been trained to see me as the family disappointment, the cautionary tale about what happened when you couldn't get your life together. "The garage is still available if you need it," Mark continued, and the table erupted in that familiar, uncomfortable laughter. "I'm just saying we're family. We take care of each other." I smiled and nodded, just like I had dozens of times before. But this time, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the remote control for the living room television. "That's very generous of you, Mark," I said, standing up slowly. "But before we talk about my living arrangements, there's something I think everyone should see." Sarah frowned. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Just watch." I pointed the remote at the television and turned it on, switching to the local news channel. Perfect timing. The evening news was just starting, and I knew exactly what the lead story would be. "Good evening. I'm Rebecca Martinez with Channel 7 News. Tonight's top story, a major business acquisition that's reshaping the regional hospitality industry." The table went silent. Mark looked annoyed at the interruption, but Sarah was watching me with growing concern. "Local businessman Barry Morrison has completed his acquisition of the prestigious Riverside Hotel Group in a deal worth $10.2 million. Making him one of the largest hospitality owners in the region." I watched their faces as the reporter's words sank in. Mark's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Sarah's eyes went wide. Tyler looked confused, glancing between the television and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "The acquisition includes 15 properties," the reporter continued, "ranging from luxury resorts to the historic Riverside Country Club, a venue known for hosting high-end weddings and corporate events." Mark's face had gone completely pale. He was staring at the screen like it was showing footage from another planet. In an exclusive interview earlier today, Morrison discussed his plans for expanding the hotel chain and his vision for the future of hospitality in our region. Then my face filled the screen. Professional headshot, expensive suit, standing in front of the Grandview Plaza with the confidence of a man who'd built something significant. The camera caught me shaking hands with the former chairman of Riverside's board, both of us smiling for the cameras. Morrison, who rebuilt his business empire over the past 5 years following personal financial setbacks, says this acquisition represents the culmination of years of strategic planning and careful growth. The silence at the table was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, the sound of Tyler's breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator. No one moved. No one spoke. The businessman declined to comment on his future acquisition plans, saying only that he's grateful for the opportunity to serve the community through quality hospitality services. I turned off the television and set the remote down on the table. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. $10 million? Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. I nodded. 10.2, actually. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face had progressed from pale to gray, and I could see him trying to process what he'd just learned. The man he'd been mocking for years, the failure he'd been offering charity to, the person he'd suggested should clean hotel rooms for a living. That man now owned more hotel rooms than anyone else in the region. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "How long have you? When did you?" 5 years, I said simply. I started rebuilding the day after the divorce was finalized. One property at a time, one decision at a time. While you all assumed I was falling apart, I was actually putting my life back together. Tyler looked up from his plate, his 8-year-old mind trying to understand what was happening. "Grandpa Barry, are you rich now?" The innocence of the question cut through the tension like a knife. Mark winced visibly at the word rich coming from his son's mouth in reference to me. "I'm comfortable, Tyler," I said, meeting my grandson's eyes for the first time in years without feeling ashamed. "I'm very comfortable." Mark finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and strained. "You never said anything. You let us think. Why didn't you tell us?" I looked around the table at these people who were supposed to be my family. Sarah, who'd excluded me from her wedding because I wasn't successful enough. Mark, who'd spent 5 years treating me like a burden. Tyler, who'd been taught to see me as the grandfather who couldn't get his life together. Tell you what, Mark, that I was working 18-hour days to rebuild what I'd lost, that I was sleeping on cots in hotel rooms I was renovating, that every penny I made went back into building something real. I kept my voice calm, conversational. When exactly should I have mentioned it? Between your jokes about my living situation? During one of your lectures about being realistic about my prospects? Sarah's eyes were filling with tears. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," I said, not unkindly but firmly. "You made assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of, and you built your relationship with me around those assumptions." Mark was staring at his plate now, unable to meet my eyes. "The garage joke," he said quietly. You were just what? Being funny? Being family?" I picked up my wine glass, surprised to find my hand completely steady. "Mark, do you know which hotel I bought first after I started rebuilding?" He shook his head. "The Riverside Country Club. The place where Sarah got married. The place where you celebrated with your family while I sat in the parking lot, uninvited." I took a sip of wine, letting that sink in. "I now own the building where you had your wedding reception. The same building I wasn't good enough to be invited into 3 years ago." Sarah made a sound that might have been a sob. "Dad, please." "I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Sarah. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. The man you've been pitying, the father you've been ashamed of, the grandfather you've been keeping at arm's length, that man built a $10 million business empire while you all assumed he was failing." I stood up, picking up my coat from the back of my chair. "The garage really was good preparation, Mark. It taught me that I didn't need anyone else's approval to rebuild my life. It taught me that I could succeed without anyone believing in me." "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Home," I said simply. "To my penthouse suite at the Grandview Plaza, the flagship property of my hotel chain." Mark's head snapped up at the word penthouse. Of course it did. The man who'd been offering me sleeping space in his garage was just now realizing that I'd been living better than any of them for the past 2 years. "Dad, please don't leave like this," Sarah pleaded. "We need to talk. We need to figure out how to fix this." I paused at the door, looking back at my family. My daughter, whose wedding I'd missed because I wasn't successful enough. My son-in-law, whose jokes had sustained him through years of feeling superior to me. My grandson, who was learning for the first time that his supposedly poor grandfather was actually the richest person he knew. "There's nothing to fix, Sarah. This is who I've always been, even when you couldn't see it. The only question now is whether you want to know the real me, or if you prefer the version you created in your minds." I walked out into the cool November evening, leaving them sitting at their dinner table with their lukewarm turkey and their shattered assumptions. Behind me, I could hear Sarah crying, and Mark's voice, low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. As I drove back to my hotel, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years. Complete peace. They knew now. The secret was out, the performance was over, and whatever happened next would be based on truth instead of assumptions. For the first time since the divorce, Barry Morrison didn't have to pretend to be anyone other than exactly who he was. 6 months had passed since that Thanksgiving dinner, and I was standing in my office at the Grandview Plaza, reviewing expansion proposals for 3 new properties in neighboring states. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating financial reports that showed numbers I'd once only dreamed of achieving. The phone calls had started the day after the revelation. First from Sarah, her voice thick with tears and apologies. Then from Mark, stammering through an awkward attempt at making amends. Even Tyler had called, his 8-year-old voice asking if he could see my big hotels. But I'd learned something valuable during those 5 years of rebuilding. Respect that comes only after success isn't really respect at all. It's just self-interest wearing a different mask. "Mr. Morrison," my assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your 11 o'clock is here." I smiled, checking my watch. "Right on time. Send him in, please." The door opened, and Mark walked into my office with the careful, hesitant steps of a man entering unfamiliar territory. He was wearing his best suit, the one he'd probably worn to job interviews before landing his position at the accounting firm. His eyes swept the room, the mahogany furniture, the city view, the awards on the wall from hospitality industry organizations. "Barry," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to one of the leather chairs across from my desk. "Have a seat. Can I offer you coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be good." He sat down, looking smaller somehow than he had at all those family dinners where he'd held court. I poured 2 cups from the executive coffee service, the same expensive European machine I'd mentioned in my thoughts that morning 6 months ago. Mark accepted his cup with a quiet, "Thank you," his hands not quite steady. "So," I said, settling back into my chair, "what can I do for you?" Mark took a sip of coffee, buying time. "I wanted to apologize for everything, the jokes, the condescension, the way I treated you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I nodded, studying his face. The apology sounded genuine, but then again, Mark had always been good with words when he needed to be. "I appreciate that. Is there something else?" He shifted uncomfortably. "The firm is downsizing. They're letting go of several mid-level accountants, and..." He swallowed hard. "I'm one of them." There it was. "I'm sorry to hear that." "I was hoping actually, if there might be opportunities within your organization. I have experience with hospitality accounting, and I know you're expanding." I set down my coffee cup and looked at him across the desk. 6 months ago, this man had been offering me space in his garage, suggesting I apply for jobs cleaning hotel rooms. Now he was sitting in my office, asking me for work. "Mark, I'm going to be honest with you. Yes, we have openings. We're growing rapidly, and we need qualified financial professionals. But I have to ask, are you here because you think I'm qualified to be your boss, or because you need a job?" His face flushed red. "I deserve that." "You do. For 5 years, you made it clear that you didn't think much of my business judgment, my prospects, or my potential. You treated me like a failure who was too proud to accept reality. Now you want to work for that same man?" Mark stared into his coffee cup. "You have every right to turn me down. I wouldn't blame you. But Barry, I need you to know. What I learned about you that night, it changed how I see everything. Not just you, but success, failure, what really matters." "And what do you think really matters?" He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since he'd entered the office. "Perseverance, dignity, the ability to rebuild when everything falls apart. You had all of that, and I was too arrogant to see it." I leaned back in my chair, considering. The truth was, we did need a senior accountant for the new properties. And Mark, despite his personal failings, was genuinely good with numbers. He'd managed Sarah's finances well, had helped several of his former clients optimize their tax situations. "If I hired you," I said slowly, "it wouldn't be charity. You'd be an employee, nothing more. You'd report to my CFO, you'd earn your position through performance, and there would be no special treatment because you're family. I understand. Do you? Because Mark, for 5 years, you've seen me as someone who needed your help, your advice, your tolerance. Can you work for someone you used to pity?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications. Mark set down his coffee cup and straightened his shoulders. "The man I used to pity was a fiction I created in my own mind," he said quietly. "The real Barry Morrison is someone I should have been trying to learn from, not lecture. So yes, I can work for you. It would be an honor." I studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, for the calculating expression he'd worn so often during those family dinners. But what I saw was something I'd never seen from Mark before. Genuine humility. "All right," I said finally. "You can start Monday. Probationary period, 6 months. Salary is $65,000 to start, with performance reviews every quarter. Are those terms acceptable?" Relief flooded his features. "More than acceptable. Thank you, Barry. I won't let you down." "See that you don't." After Mark left, I turned back to my window, watching the city below. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Dad, can we have lunch this week? I want to try again." Over the past 6 months, Sarah had been trying to rebuild our relationship. She'd brought Tyler to visit the hotels, had invited me to his baseball games, had even suggested I join them for Christmas. But there was something different about her approach now, a carefulness, a deference that hadn't been there before. She was trying to love the successful father, but I wasn't sure she'd ever really known how to love the struggling one. That was the tragedy of our situation. The revelation hadn't just changed how she saw me. It had revealed that her love had always been conditional on my success. Tyler, surprisingly, had been the easiest to reconnect with. Children are adaptable, and once he understood that Grandpa Barry wasn't poor after all, he'd embraced our relationship with the enthusiasm of an 8-year-old discovering something new and exciting. We'd had several Saturday adventures, exploring my different hotels, swimming in the pools, ordering room service, all the things I'd dreamed of doing with my grandson, but had never been invited to share. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in." My CFO, Patricia Chen, entered with a folder under her arm. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review. Also, the Milwaukee property bid was accepted. Congratulations. You just added hotel number 18 to the Morrison portfolio. 18 properties. When I'd started rebuilding 5 years ago with that rundown motel, I'd dreamed of maybe owning 3 or 4 small hotels. Now I was running a regional hospitality empire, and the growth showed no signs of slowing. Excellent work, Patricia. Schedule a meeting with the management team for next week. We'll need to discuss staffing for the new property." After she left, I pulled out my phone and responded to Sarah's text. "Lunch sounds good. Tuesday at noon? I know a nice place." The place I had in mind was the restaurant at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where she'd gotten married without me, where she'd celebrated the happiest day of her life while I sat in the parking lot, excluded and unwanted. Now it was mine, and we'd sit in the dining room I'd been deemed unworthy to enter, served by staff who called me Mr. Morrison and treated me with the respect I'd earned. Not out of spite, but because I wanted Sarah to understand something. The father she'd been ashamed of had always been capable of greatness. The man she'd written off had simply been temporarily down, never permanently defeated. That evening, I drove to Tyler's baseball game. Sarah had started inviting me to his activities, part of her campaign to rebuild our relationship. I sat in the stands, watching my grandson play second base, his face focused and determined in a way that reminded me of myself at his age. "Nice hit, Tyler," I called out when he connected with a pitch, sending the ball sailing into left field. He looked over at the stands, found me, and grinned. That smile was worth everything. All the lonely nights in hotel rooms under construction, all the years of rebuilding in silence, all the sacrifices I'd made to get back to a place where I could be a grandfather my grandson was proud to claim. After the game, Tyler ran over to where I was standing by the fence. "Grandpa Barry, did you see my hit?" "I saw it. Excellent form. Your batting stance is improving. Mom says you might take me to see the hotel with the big pool next weekend." I looked over at Sarah, who was packing up her lawn chair and trying not to look directly at us. She was still learning how to navigate this new version of our relationship, still trying to figure out how to be the daughter of a successful father instead of a failed one. "If your mom says it's okay, I'd love to show you the resort up in the mountains. It has 3 pools and a water slide." Tyler's eyes lit up. "Really? Can Mark come too?" I smiled at the innocent question. Tyler had no idea that Mark would soon be working for me, that the family dynamics were shifting in ways an 8-year-old couldn't fully understand. If he wants to come, he's welcome. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been the family disappointment, the man everyone pitied and no one respected. Tonight, I was driving back to my penthouse suite, having just watched my grandson play baseball while planning lunch with my daughter and preparing to give my former tormentor a job. The victory wasn't just financial. It wasn't about the money or the properties or the business empire. It was about dignity. It was about proving to myself and my family that Barry Morrison couldn't be kept down permanently. That sometimes, the people everyone writes off are the ones who surprise them the most. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the Grandview Plaza, my flagship property, my home, my castle built from determination and silent perseverance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chapters in the story I was still writing. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, Barry Morrison was exactly where he belonged, on top of the world he'd rebuilt with his own hands. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.